Henry Arthur Thatch, the only son of Harold and Emily Thatch of Birmingham, England. I never felt the need to look into this before succumbing to the fact that I was indeed destined to enter the last lodge. I honestly can't say. Given the fact that he essentially handed me this information quite early in my quest for answers, I have to assume that he was permitting me, encouraging me even, to look into his background. Yeah, it's easy to argue that I was more distracted by everything else going on around me, but why did I ignore this? I mean, he didn't give me this sprinkling of knowledge until the night I almost lost Ted. So yeah, my mind was in 1,000 different places at that moment. Of course, none of this really counts for much in the long run. I so rarely get to experience the world beyond those wooden walls. Is that place even made of wood? Does wood even exist in that reality? Even now, there are still so many questions I've never been able to answer. I suppose that these are simply things I allow my mind to rest on occasion. Distractions. Yeah, distractions can be nice. Any distraction from this tedious existence. My unpredictable fellow tenants in that damned underbelly of the universe. I'm sorry, I'm getting sidetracked. Not exactly used to this manner of communication anymore. I know that it's been a while since we last spoke, so to speak. I apologize for that, but believe me when I say that this has not entirely been within my grasp to so casually reach out like I used to. Suffice it to say, a lot has happened since our last meeting. A lot more than I ever could have imagined. If my calculations are right, to anyone who is familiar with my story, it's been around a year since you last heard from me. 2 years? Maybe 3? Forgive me, not only does time work differently in there, but some areas are not quite chronological, if that makes sense. For me, it's been around... 30 years? Christ, has it really been that long? I mean, I haven't aged. Another aspect of life within those walls to which I am still not fully accustomed. I still look the same. My bones don't creak any more than they used to. My back and knees are no more achy than they were before I entered. My mind, though... yeah. I'm not the same man who entered. I don't feel like I am anyway. I feel colder, more goal-oriented, more focused, and not in a good way. Yeah, a lot to tell, a little time to tell it. I might have to skip around in a few places, but I'll try to at least keep coherent. It's not as easy or convenient as it used to be to reach the outside world, as I mentioned. But I do have some privileges that many of the other residents don't. I'll get more into the nature of these privileges as well as life inside that damned place soon enough. Just a little more to be told about my journey leading up to this from our last communication. I only have so much time before I need to get back, before I'm expected to come back. Over the years, though, I've found more who are friendly to the cause I took up decades ago. There are still some places in which I can find sanctuary, where my thoughts as well as my words can be free to roam as they wish. Where I am now, it's something of a safe space, free from the prying eyes of those who would take more than a little offense to me sharing anything about the lodge. I suppose it's not unlike the space between. A place that... well, I honestly don't even know if it exists anymore. Nor those with whom I spent many days and nights before... Okay, Yeah, that's enough about all that for now, at least. Even after coming to the understanding that I was bound to end up inside the lodge, my entry came with a much steeper cost than anything I would ever have been willing to pay. It all began with another aspect of my investigation. One last thing I had to know before offering myself freely. The truth about the man who would ultimately lead me through the door. I suppose that... let me see. Last we spoke, yeah, it was after I understood that I must enter that... Christ, I don't even know what that place is. I do have some ideas, though. Yeah, that's a conversation for another time, too. It was Betty's idea to look into Thatch, or who he was before the lodge took him. Sure, without hearing the story from him, there was no way to know if the lodge had sought him out, or if he offered himself freely to whatever entity lies within or behind those walls. With what I had come to learn about that ominous building over those initial months of my investigation, though, I had a feeling that Thatch had been a person of interest, just like I was. Perhaps it was simply the fact that I had grown to see the old man as something of a friend, but he didn't exactly seem particularly fond of his incarceration, for lack of a more fitting term. Yeah, no, that term fits quite perfectly, actually. Forense Jones had been lured through that door. The Abernathy brothers had apparently lost many to that place. Hell, the only person I had met who actually wanted to gain entry was Arnold Dayton, and he wasn't exactly of sound mind. Okay, I know I'm sort of talking in circles here. I'm not the calm and composed man I used to be back before that ill-fated trip to Tom's place. What feels like a lifetime ago now. Back before I belonged to the lodge. Shit. Did I ever not belong to that fucking place? Henry Thatch. Yeah. If I was going to allow him to escort me through that door, I needed to know who he was before he became a prisoner himself. Though I had grown fond of the man who saved not only myself from whatever the mysterious Alistair had planned, but Betty and Ted from the torture and likely death he demanded, I still didn't trust him, nor did I expect that I ever would. Christ, I miss those two. I distanced myself from Ted after everything that happened. Betty, Christ, I haven't seen her since... Searching online for any information on Henry or his parents yielded no results, not unlike my initial investigation into the last lodge. But I wasn't about to just leave it at that. While I was searching on the outside, Betty, who remained at the space between, delved into whatever records they held. I had spent a good deal of time in that bar on the outskirts of town, ever since accepting the fact that I must enter the lodge. By this point, maybe a few months since I realized I couldn't escape my fate. I still wasn't familiar with whatever secrets it held behind the facade of a local tavern. Yeah, I had spent a few hours in one of the apparently numerous rooms while I recovered from hitting the floor, what feels like centuries ago. But I still hadn't wandered any further in. Not at that point. Betty and Simon both had mentioned little things here and there while we whittled away the hours, days, and weeks discussing my future. Honestly, the way they talked about it, I had come to believe that there was an entire community somehow hidden away within those walls. Not unlike how I pictured the lodge itself, for that matter. Looking back at the man I used to be, I see what a sheltered fool I was, still bound by the limitations of what I considered to be the real world. I saw things in only 3 dimensions, believing that physics, science, even religion could account for anything. Even with everything I had witnessed, I held on to this sheltered outlook, unyielding and stubborn. Some 3, maybe 4 or 5 months, it's been a long time, after the events that almost claimed the lives of Betty and Ted, I would learn not only a good deal more about Henry Thatch, but of the vast reach of the space between as well. Simon, who I'd grown to see as a friend over many late-night conversations, was to be my escort on this occasion. Not long before that day, I would have honestly felt a little awkward just accompanying him on this. It's funny how such vastly different people can so quickly form friendships when faced with the truly bizarre. While Betty had been my primary liaison with the mysterious bar up until this point, she yielded to her old friend on this one. Not only was he far more familiar with the place, as he had been hiding out there since his death, but with much persuading on my behalf, I requested that she begin to distance herself from this investigation as well. I blamed myself for her being abducted by Arnold Dayton, truth be told. I never came out and told her that, but I suspect that she knew, given how my face had a tendency to betray me at times, like any time mention of that ordeal came up. She reluctantly agreed to take something of a back seat, but outright refused to back off completely. Whether it was from my own conviction faltering, or the simple fact that, regardless of everything she had withheld from me, her presence in my life was one of the only things that kept me going. I couldn't bring myself to push her away completely. I knew that she may still be in danger, but I rationalized that there was no stopping that now. Not with her being a significant part of this. No matter what, though, one of my final stipulations to finally enter that damn cabin would be a promise that no harm would come to her or anyone else who had been dragged into this madness. Granted, at this point, I hadn't spoken with Thatch since that awful night in that small town many miles away. I can't deny that it occurred to me that perhaps the lodge had lost interest in me, or decided that I wasn't worth the trouble after all. Somehow, though, I knew that wasn't the case. I can't quite explain it, but I already felt connected to it. That I was already a part of it. That it was a part of me. As it was, I still had to write that damned book after all. Whatever it would have in store for me after that, I couldn't even begin to predict. But I knew that much. When Dorian raised the flap on the counter, gesturing for me to follow him through the door behind the bar, I was honestly a bit more excited than reluctant. Betty didn't appear to be distressed in any way, as she often would when discussing the finer points of handing myself over to the lodge. If anything, she seemed more carefree than I had seen her in weeks. She may not have been particularly familiar with everything which lay behind and beneath this tavern, but she knew far more than I did. Her being so relaxed as I followed her old friend was almost enough to calm my hastened pulse. Yeah, almost. The hallway which led beyond the simple wooden door appeared as though it stretched for miles. There were sporadic doors on either side of us as we walked onward, the sounds of conversations and glasses clinking together fading into a muted blur. None of the entrances to what I assumed to be rooms, not unlike the one I awoke in some time back, were numbered, but each of them differed. Some were just subtle variances, a darker shaded knob or color palette of the wood, while others were more dramatic. One door was slender, almost half the width of its neighbor. Another, about 2/3 the height. Some were dramatically darker in shade, and others much lighter. One was round, similar to a hobbit's home. Across from that one, a perfect square, with even a cubic knob. When we finally reached the end of the hallway, some 10 to 15 minutes later after beginning our stroll, we had the option of a left or a right turn. Without a word or any hesitation, Simon veered left. I continued to follow along, growing more and more curious how such a lengthy corridor could be concealed within the small tavern I'd seen from the road the first time I arrived here. But my questions were multiplying exponentially. The hallway looked exactly like the one we left behind, with many new doors of many new colors and a few different dimensions. When we reached an elevator hidden behind 2 sliding ironwork gates, again, Dorian just glided right in, as though he had done this 100 times. The numbers assigned to what I would assume to be floors were completely unrecognizable to me, looking more like hieroglyphics than anything familiar to my eyes. Simon wordlessly studied them for a moment before bouncing his fingers against a triangular shape with a series of lines running through it. The ride upward, or what felt like we were moving up, only took a few minutes, but the elevator didn't so much as shake or shudder, just drifted smoothly until stopping with a ding. Upon exiting, I resumed following behind my guide as we almost appeared to be walking back the way we came, through the startlingly similar hallway. The variances in the doors was the only thing distinguishing this corridor from the one we left some floors below, but when we came to the choice between a right turn or heading onward, Dorian turned again without hesitation. After another 10 or 15 minutes, when Simon pushed through the simple wooden door at the end of the hallway, I found myself looking upon the very same bar in which I had met him only an hour or so prior. That's what I thought, anyway. Dorian gave a smile and a nod to the tall and stocky bearded man tending bar, a man I had never laid eyes on before he strolled out around the counter, holding the flap up for me as I passed through. I gave him a bit of a perplexed glance while cutting my eyes around the place, to which he returned a strangely mischievous wink. I had to stop for a moment when he guided me through the exit, the city street we appeared on as unrecognizable to me as the bartender. Given that I had driven to the outskirts of my town to reach this bar, I could not fathom how we were now surrounded by pedestrians coming and going. "Where?" was all I could convince my lips to utter. "Paris," Dorian replied, gesturing with a tilt of his head as he began to stroll to the right. "It's not far from here." "Paris? Fucking Paris? What's not far from here?" "The library." "Huh?" "Now, we don't exactly keep our records on site. Not these kind of records, anyway. But the bar isn't the only place friendly to our cause." How did we get here?" That's a bit above my pay grade. Sometimes best not to ask, you know?" "How can you not ask? I mean, if we just traveled across the fucking world by riding an elevator, how can—"
"We're here,"
he interrupted, pulling open a heavy-looking, somewhat extravagant door to a building on our left. As the scent of possibly centuries-old books drifted into my nostrils, the vision revealed on the other side of the open door allowed the previous topic to drift to the recesses of my already scattered mind. I don't think I've ever seen so many shelves or so many books before, but it almost took my breath away. This didn't look like some random street corner bookshop, nor some garden variety library. Regardless of the handful of shops and restaurants we had passed by on our short walk to this place, looking in no way different from any average city street across which I had strolled before, this building appeared as though it should be a main attraction for tourists. I craned my neck to take in the size of it, seeing more levels and floors than I could count at the time, each lined with more shelves filled with books. The lobby area was open, with shelves arranged in a wide circle around the desk, at which a well-dressed, elderly man sat, waving at my guide. That open circle was constant through the many floors, with stairs at the left and right to access the next levels. I was absent-mindedly following behind Dorian as he approached the man, but my eyes could not break from the ironwork details around and within the skylight high above.
"Bonjour, Monsieur Roman. Qu'avez-vous trouvé?"
Simon asked the man who arose from his chair to greet us with a friendly nod. The sophisticated-looking guy with a pencil-thin mustache, wide-rimmed glasses, and a slender but friendly face just smiled as he pulled the book from beneath the counter, handing it to Dorian with a nod. The two talked back and forth for a few moments, while the elderly gent cut occasional glances in my direction without actually acknowledging me. Given that I had no bloody idea what they were saying to each other, I chose not to take any offense to these seemingly uncertain glimpses. My mind was still recuperating from the cross-world elevator, not to mention my inherent and ever-present anxiety about my upcoming entry into the last fucking lodge. The last thing I needed was to get into some language barrier dispute.
Merci, mon ami,
Simon said, bowing his head to the elderly gent. When the old guy glanced my way with what appeared to be a very forced smile struggling its way across his lips, I just returned a smile and a nod. Dorian gestured for me to follow behind him again as he began to stroll back to the door with the heavy-looking book tucked under his arm.
What was that all about?
I asked once we stepped back into the sidewalk, the door drifting closed behind me.
Monsieur Ramond is... well, he is no friend to the lodge. This is one of many establishments sort of connected to the space between. And he, amongst a handful of others, has read,
The lodge is waiting, I said with a sigh, to which Simon returned another nod. We talked for a bit over the stroll back to the street-side bar about a variety of these establishments friendly to our cause, as Dorian told it. Apparently, most of these places were within walking distance of whatever iteration of the space between exists in many cities across the globe. In some cases, such as the extravagant library in Paris, passers-by would be fully unaware that there was anything otherworldly to these places. For the most part, according to Dorian, those without any connection to the lodge would inherently have no desire to even enter these buildings. As far out as this concept sounded to me, I was more concerned with how they stayed in business, if the only patronage they got was from people seeking refuge or information about that damn cabin.
They get by,
was all Simon had to say on that subject. By this point, we had already departed the elevator back to my more familiar corner of the world, making our way up the hallway back to the lobby of the bar. As the door we would access to return to the bar on the outskirts of my small town came into view, I grew aware of the raised voices. I couldn't make out a single word, nor could I narrow down exactly where this apparent argument was coming from. But as I took note of Simon clenching his jaw, releasing a fairly winded sigh, I had a feeling that he knew exactly what was going on.
You good, man?
I asked. This was probably the first time I had seen him looking as tense as this, and considering the range of topics we had discussed since we met, that was no small thing. He just nodded before stopping in place, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the entrance back to whatever the real world was anymore.
You mind waiting here for a few?
He asked, his expression both apprehensive and apologetic.
Yeah, sure.
What's going on?
A few of the residents don't necessarily agree with some of the things we're trying to accomplish.
Like, we?
No, nothing to do with this, or you for that matter. There's a lot going on right now. Some stuff you know about, and some... well, it's not just a one-man job taking down the lodge, you know?
Not really, I said with a laugh. But I get what you're saying.
Just trust me, yeah? You don't need to stress this on top of everything else.
Again, his expression was sincere and somewhat annoyed by the situation. To be honest, he was absolutely right. I had enough on my mind without dealing with disgruntled tenants.
I'll just wait here. I'm sorry about this, man,
Simon said, beginning his stroll ahead of me.
It should just be a few, alright?
As he pushed through the door, the volume of the angered words ramped up enough for me to catch a few.
You're just giving it exactly what it wants. What the fuck?
Cool it, Samuel,
Dorian said as the door drifted shut behind him. The second it closed, everything beyond it became muffled again, making it impossible to pick up anything. I edged a few steps forward, my curiosity overruling my desire to stay the hell out of this, but I still couldn't make out much of anything. The closer I got to the bar again, though, I did grasp a few words. Not enough to paint a picture of the exact subject matter being discussed, but enough to realize that Simon may have been less than honest about this having nothing to do with me. That fucking book, for example. There was no way I could deny that involved me directly. Can't let him walk right in was another that jabbed a fork in my spine. Simon was seemingly keeping his voice low, making his words impossible to understand. Whether this was for my benefit or to simply attempt not to aggravate the situation anymore, I couldn't honestly say. But from where I stood, I couldn't help but to assume that perhaps not everybody was on board with the plan for me to walk willingly into the lodge, or to ultimately write that damned book. Yes, the book already existed. Nothing could change that. But what if that wasn't entirely true? As things began to calm down, from what I could tell, I backed up to around the position I was in before Dorian asked me to remain. I knew that the last thing I needed was to make assumptions, but at the same time, those doubts I had been experiencing the beginning of all this were steadily coming out of remission. With my mind attempting to process all of this, I didn't even notice Simon poking his head through the door, until he called out my name, causing my absent mind to collide back with my overly tense shell. And my pulse had quickened a bit by the time I strolled back into the bar, settling down a little more when I only saw Betty and Simon in the otherwise vacant area. Everything all right?" I asked, still cutting uneasy glances around the room.
Close enough,"
Dorian said, gesturing to the stool next to the smiling yet visibly rattled brunette. Over the following hour or so, and a couple of chilled beers later, Betty and I just made some small talk, while Dorian flipped through the pages of the book he had received from Monsieur Ramon. I was still anxious, of course, but sharing the company of the woman who still managed to make my pulse race for a very different reason set my mind at ease a good deal. As I continued to be more enraptured by the brunette before me with every word and each shift in her expression, we both grew steadily more distracted by the man behind the bar, leaping from one ancient page to the next. After a time, the silence consumed the room, while Betty and I found ourselves just glaring at Dorian, whose now glassy eyes vaguely reflected the text before him. Some 10 minutes passed by while Simon didn't even react to the eyes glued to his melancholy expression. But when he finally looked up to meet Betty's gaze first, then darting his leaking eyes to mine, he just let out a small, yet completely ingenuine chuckle.
"I kinda zoned out for a bit, I guess,"
he said, blinking rapidly against the burgeoning tears. Betty and I both asked if he was all right, my stuttered words clumsily stumbling into her far more confidently concerned ones. Dorian just returned a nod, simply gesturing to the book with a shrug.
"It's heavy stuff."
He poured 3 pints, still seemingly settling himself down, passed one each to Betty and I, and cleaned off a good half of the one he prepared for himself, topping it back off before returning to his stool across from where we sat. After another moment of silence, with some glances exchanging between the three of us, Dorian went on to share what the book borrowed from that library in France revealed to him. The brief history of Henry Arthur Thatch, his life, and how it led him across the threshold of the last lodge. Born in 1863 to Harold and Emily Thatch, Henry would initially find his presence far from welcome in the quite sizable house deep in what was coming to be referred to as the Black City. Harold Thatch, a businessman by trade and one of the higher-ups behind the ever-growing manufacturing industry of the 19th century Birmingham, had little time to be troubled by his offspring. Yes, he did provide for his wife, Emily, with quite a comfortable lifestyle, and by default, his firstborn as well. But that didn't necessarily mean that he cared for either of them. While it was his station and a good deal of pressure from his father, Ambrose Thatch, that led to his marriage in the first place, he could never admit to the world that he had never thought particularly highly of the opposite sex. His mother, the Paris-born Lucia Dupont, had always been something of a disappointment to her son. Granted, it was the manner with which her husband treated her that led to this outlook from the young Harold, but with the respect Ambrose demanded from his spouse and his 3 sons, they were all somewhat bred to look down on women. In the case of Henry's father, of course, this not only embedded this inherent distaste for an entire gender, but also to what would genuinely attract him, something quite frowned upon in such times. As the young boy grew, feeling the resentment from both of his parents, one having grown distant due to the neglect and abuse from her husband, and the other having grown more aware that his child did not resemble him in the slightest, inspiring a festering pit of hatred, Henry had begun to detest himself as much as those tasked with raising him. Harold, though he chose to never question his wife on this matter, was certain that Emily had indeed been unfaithful to him. Yes, this wasn't exactly hard to believe, since he only rarely embraced her, let alone taking part in any activity which could lead to a pregnancy. But he did have a reputation to uphold. Such a respected man of stature and class could never be seen for one so easily disrespected by any woman, especially his own wife. Plus, he could not risk the truth of his own illicit affairs from being exposed. So he simply continued to berate, abuse, and neglect his wife and her offspring behind the safety of his closed doors. When the young Henry reached the brink of adolescence, though, his father could no longer deny that not only did the boy still show not the slightest trace of sharing his blood, but he was growing to be quite the striking young man. That's when Harold would take both his resentment and abuse to another level. Simon's voice cracked and trembled as he read aloud these words. Betty was covering her mouth with her eyes glazing, while I felt my own tears trickling down my face. None of our eyes met as the room fell silent, her narrator seemingly needing a moment before continuing. I can't deny that I needed some time to allow this to sink in as well. Yes, Henry Thatch was an adversary, the one tasked by the lodge to lure me in, but I could not deny that I had grown to care for the man. Even with everything I had endured since Firenze Jones introduced me to that goddamn cabin, Thatch had always shown me nothing but kindness. Sure, I may have been little more than a job to him, just his mission as tasked by whatever or whoever controls whatever that building truly is. But it never felt that way. He could have easily led me through that door several times already. Hell, once he had actually prevented me from walking in. Well, this investigation into the lodge had led me and those I care for to the very brink of death. Henry Arthur Thatch had already saved me, I suspect, more than once already. He had never forced me one way or another, never pushed. And yes, I did. I do see him as a kind soul. If anything, hearing even just a fraction of his troubled childhood long before he ended up within those wooden walls only made me understand this for the first time. To truly accept that I had to see him as a friend, with how much my heart was breaking from these revelations. When I finally glanced up from my fidgeting fingers, upon which my gaze had been focused for some minutes now, seeing the compassionate expression from the lovely brunette at my side, and the understanding smirk of the young man behind the bar, I only returned a smile and a nod, silently confirming that, though not fully prepared, I was ready to hear the rest of the story. Before Simon could so much as cut his eyes back to the weathered pages before him, though, the sudden but gentle tapping against the front door inspired all 3 of us to practically leap from our seats. When my eyes hastily drifted to the frosted glass of the entrance to see the short and slender silhouette on the other side, I felt both my back stiffen and my heart pierce with an almost jarring stab. With a single, somewhat shaky nod from Dorian as I glanced back to him, Betty laid a hand on my shoulder as I rose from my stool to almost gelatinous legs. Once more, the kind and weathered eyes of Henry Thatch met my own, His gentle and strangely understanding smile revealed to me that he was well aware of what we were discussing. And, Mr. Thatch, what are...
Fear not, my boy,
the elderly man said both to me and to the one slack-jawed behind the bar.
I am not here as a representative of the lodge, but of myself.
But how do you even know about this place?
My dear young man and young lady, alas, there are no secrets.
There was no malice behind his gaze, only a semblance of guilt, perhaps. It was as though he felt ashamed for having to reveal that the powers behind the lodge were all too aware of our seemingly glaringly obvious plot.
May I?
He asked, gesturing behind the entrance with a tilt of the head. Again, I glanced at Dorian, who simply shrugged at my unspoken request for the best course of action.
I assure you, I have no motivation beyond the truth.
The playful smirk which crossed the wrinkled lips only inspired an oddly ashamed giggle from me. With a tilt of my head, I stepped to the side, honestly quite curious as to whether or not an emissary of the last lodge could enter this place. With a slight bow, the elderly man stepped forward, halfway crossing the threshold before stopping in place. He gave a soft chuckle, glancing to the pocket of his trousers, which seemed unable to pass through the entrance. He backed up again, and slipped a small brass key from within. Setting the key down upon the concrete outside, just beside the doorway, he resumed his stroll. Simon appeared to stiffen a bit as the small-statured man approached the counter, with his hands placed behind his back. But when Henry simply asked,
"Might I trouble you for a pint?"
Dorian offered him a smile, reaching for a clean glass.
"Oh, that is lovely indeed,"
the elderly man said, with his eyes shut and his smile wide after taking that first sip of the chilled draft. Simon still appeared uncomfortable around the elderly man, while Betty almost came off as though she were greeting nothing more nefarious than a friendly neighbor.
"You are looking well, Mr. Dorian,"
Thatch said, a playful smirk crossing his lips. Simon just chuckled, allowing his visible tension to release.
"They didn't believe my death for a second, did they?"
Henry smiled back at him, a warm, gentle smile.
"A second, perhaps even two. But you fulfilled your role in all of this,"
he said, gesturing all around him, as though embracing the world in his slender arms.
"There was no harm in allowing you the freedom you sought."
Dorian only tilted his head, almost appearing a bit annoyed by his isolation from the world beyond these walls. Again, he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head with a sigh.
"There is nothing to fear, lad,"
Thatch said, his expression still friendly and peaceful.
"You are free. The lodge shall pursue you no longer."
Having taken the stool I had vacated, as offered to him by the kind-eyed, bespectacled brunette when he entered, I sat on his other side. As Henry gave a courteous nod to our bartender, cutting his eyes to the book upon the counter, and back to the almost guilty expression of the one before him, he only offered an understanding smile.
"You know,"
he said, looking from Simon to Betty and over to me,
"you need only have asked."
I just giggled like a nervous kid caught sneaking a 20 from his father's wallet. I kind of thought you wanted me, us, to look into it, to you. You told me your parents' names and your place of birth. I assumed that was, I don't know, a hint or something? Again he smiled, taking another enthusiastic sip from his glass.
"Or,"
he said, dabbing a napkin against his frothy upper lip,
"I may have been welcoming an opportunity to converse further with you."
I opened my mouth to speak words my brain refused to send to my vocal cords, only stuttering as though drool may drip from my slack jaw any moment.
"But,"
Henry began again,
"I would be happy to, Well, take it from here. Should this be acceptable?
After some awkward back and forth between the four of us, our initial trio each tripping over our words, as I suspect we each felt somewhat ashamed of being caught in the act, as it were, we all agreed to lend the spotlight to our unexpected guest. I can't deny that my pulse was racing as he began to speak. The already existing pain of hearing about his troubled life from a third party only worsened as it was told from the source himself. But even to this day, after so many years removed from the reality I once knew, I recall every single word he spoke. Not only that, but even after everything I have endured since the beginning of this madness, I do and will always consider Henry Arthur Thatch a friend. I still miss the man I once feared, and no matter what happens from here, I will always be grateful to have had the opportunity to know him. I'm sorry about that. I had a moment, I suppose. After a bit of catching up on where we had reached in the story of his life, Thatch, with something of an almost ashamed expression and a slightly trembling sigh, picked up right where Dorian had ended.
Well, I had grown such a resentment for my father. I still feared him. He was a large, powerful, intimidating man, you see. His reputation and his responsibilities imbued him with something of a arrogant confidence, which could so easily cripple those weaker than he. As it was, I was amongst those unfortunate many. His contempt since my birth had instilled within me such inner doubts and insecurities. He knew how to overpower me with naught but a glance, and when his desires joined forces with his rage and bitterness, there was nothing I could do, or nothing with which I had the confidence or strength to achieve. Not back then. Yes, my screams and wails protested every action he inflicted upon me. They reverberated against the walls, earning not the slightest intervention from the one who released me into this cruel existence, nor any neighbors who may have potentially witnessed these sounds. Night after night, he would enter my chambers, breaking the door from its hinges on the night I attempted to prevent him from invading. After some weeks of this, I learned to detach, to send my mind elsewhere in search of sanctuary from this waking nightmare. My mother would no longer acknowledge me. Yes, she would continue to prepare my meals, but she too had detached from both this family and this life, an empty husk of bone and meat, not unlike her only child. Years passed by. I was only reminded of this by the shifting of the seasons, which was not always noticeable through the smog of this growing city of industry. The Black City, as it was, due to the ever-present cloud of pollutants and despair. By the time I reached 16 years of age, still slender and small in stature for my years, I had become little more than a walking corpse. Days turned to nights, and nights turned to unfocused images of violation, anguish, and melancholy. My mother was a shell of even her former self, barely reacting to the lashings from her husband or the vague passage of time. This was the sole common ground she and I shared anymore, aside from some passing resemblance due to shared DNA. We had both mentally and emotionally departed this world, our flesh the possession of the man of the house. If nothing else, with emotions all but stripped from me, I was excelling in my studies. with this being amongst the very few escapes from the grim reality of life as the son of a thatch, I clung to it, the shadow of hope within me that I could someday be free from that house, the only thing keeping me going. That, along with my absent senses, of course. With my father working during the day, and my mother a barely sentient cell, I had grown to merely drift absently, even during my walks to school and back. While I did indeed devote my mind exclusively to the lessons taught, there was so little left of who I could have been anymore, that I was little more than a shadow. I neither pursued friendships nor romantic interests, existing only in the moments in which I allowed my thoughts to focus on a particular subject. I spoke to no one unless spoken to. Even in such moments I hardly recognized the sound and sensation of my own voice. It was in the late autumn of 1879, 1 month past my 17th birthday, which came and went with neither acknowledgment nor reward, when I met the one who would awaken me from the catatonic state which had consumed me over the past half-decade. As always, I was only vaguely aware of my surroundings as I returned to the prison my father called a home. My breathing grew more strained the closer I drew to that damned building I was determined to vacate the moment I may be free to carve my own path. Yes, though I was little more than semi-sentient meat to my guardians, I maintained enough awareness to forge that plan, to leave in the night when my school days came to a close, to depart the lives of my parents, and flee the city whether I had lodgings or not. It was while my mind embraced this, distancing from the body which contained it, when both were rapidly forced back together by a near blinding strike against my left temple. 2 large, scruffy men, who appeared possibly vagrants, shuffled through my pockets as I lay bleeding in the snow. The dizziness may have been blissful, were it not for the crippling, stabbing agony from where my head had both swelled and leaked to the ground. Though I could not decipher a word they spoke, my mind barely grappling onto consciousness, it was clear that they were agitated. I had no funds, nothing of worth on my person, no watch, no jewelry, only the antique uniform of which my father had outgrown many years prior, and shoes I had worn these past years, so small now that they crushed my toes more with every step I took. Yes, I had nothing of particular worth on my person, but clearly these 2 were not content to leave empty-handed. In between kicks to my sides, the tips of their shoes making contact with little more than the ribs beneath, they were stripping the clothes from me. Once I was left bare, bruised and bloody upon the snow, they took turns stomping their heels into my abdomen. With each thrust, blood spat from my lips, but when more sticky specks of crimson fluids spilled to my face and chest, I had not enough consciousness left to understand that this had not oozed from my own shivering flesh. While I drifted in between the waking world and that of tormented dreams, I steadily grew more aware of the moans and grunts not produced by assaults on my person, but of those who had previously seen fit to leave me naked, bloody, and dead on the street. When warm hands appeared from beyond the foggy darkness surrounding my spinning head, I winced again, readying myself for more pain. The gentle voice whispered that I would be safe now, while this apparent stranger aided in redressing my trembling frame. With my tattered clothing back in place, a thick and several sizes too large coat was wrapped around me after I was helped back to my weakened legs. As my vision vaguely returned, my watering eyes met a far more gentle gaze than I do believe I had ever witnessed before that day. The large, muscled man, wearing only a shirt and waistcoat, above his seemingly high-priced trousers, as he nestled me deeper into the lengthy coat within which he had wrapped me. His grey speckled sideburns encased his upper lip, with straight salt and pepper hair spilling from beneath his bowler hat around his rounded spectacles. But those bright green eyes behind the lenses only reflected compassion and a hint of sorrow. He maintained his grip around me as he guided me inside a nearby building, one of which it would seem I had never paid much attention to during my absent-minded strolls. But the very second when the warmth and soothing scarlet glow within caressed me, I could almost swear that I immediately felt life return to each of my aching extremities. We talked for a time after my voice regained its ability to whisper from my lips, a conversation which would ultimately be lost to my memories after I finally exited that magical place to resume my trip back to the house I considered my own personal hell. But the seed of our discussion would be planted deeply enough within me to resonate behind my conscious thoughts. My mind remained quite distant from my otherwise moderately repaired, yet still broken shell. Perhaps that is why I would not notice until some time later that the crimson blotches, still visible through the new fallen snow, were the only evidence of the men who assaulted me. That, of course, along with the remaining wounds from my head to my toes. The hour being far later than I would normally reach my parents' home, my father had already returned from his job. Yes, his agitated voice was barely an echo to my still distracted mind, but it was quite clear that it was exclusively the extended delay in my arrival which caught his attention, and neither the blood staining my clothes nor the wounds which provided them. I only proceeded to my chambers, while he continued to chant his jeers and insults behind me, his words lessening in volume the further from him I distanced myself. My mind remained detached for the remainder of that day, evening, and night. Under such circumstances, my awareness hovering somewhere beyond my more in-the-moment husk of flesh, I could not entirely decipher the entire truth of what actually occurred after I laid my body to rest that night. When my otherwise distracted thoughts relocated the body from which they originated, I was only immediately aware of two facts. The first was that, at some point since I had donned my pajamas, my body and clothing had sustained more damage. My left eye was swollen shut, my lower lip dripped fresh blood, and there were deep lacerations beneath the rips in my shirt and trousers. The second point of interest to me at that moment, one from which I was quite emotionally removed, was the shocked, vacant gaze of my father, from where he lay dead upon the floor of the kitchen. As my eyes drifted across the gaping, oozing wounds carved into his face and torso, they met the mincemeat of his ruined genitals. Seeing no trace of his trousers, only the crimson-stained shirt and rolled-up sleeves, I glanced back to the splayed open door to my bedroom and the bloody footprints leading to where I now stood. My fingers violently trembled, releasing from their grip something I would not fully register until it fell to the moistened floor. When I focused on the blade as it gently rocked upon the tiles beneath my shivering feet, it was not especially difficult to paint a picture of what my mind seemed incapable of recalling. Having suffered his abuse for so many years, it was of no surprise that I found myself incapable of enduring any more, especially after the events of the day. But I still could barely conceive of a reality in which these hands were capable of such an act. I cannot begin to know how long I stood in place, gazing upon the remains of the one who violently tore away my innocence so many years prior and continued to eviscerate more of my essence each night. But when a high-pitched wail inspired my mind to once more collide with my weakened flesh, I dropped to my knees before the haunted gaze of my mother. We only glared at each other for a time, her expression drifting between horror and something almost pensive. But when her eyes widened, as though struck by a most startling revelation, she only began to cry all the more hopelessly, wrapping her arms around me. Though it had seemed quite obvious to me what my father had put me through all this time, it was clear in those moments that my mother's denial of what her husband was far more stubborn than any evidence. While her blubbering made her words difficult to decipher, she only apologized in many varying ways about never seeing it before. Over the following hours, we attempted to devise a plan on how to proceed, being that my father was a respected and well-known man in this city. But there was no getting around the facts of the matter. There would be no realistic way of hiding the truth, and even if anyone believed what he did to me to drive me to this act, I would be unlikely to ever be free again. We hadn't the luxury of time, of course, though our neighbors were no strangers to ignoring the screams echoing from this house, pretending that they were not indeed well aware of the true nature of its owner. There was no escaping the fact that I must flee before the man's wife would be forced to summon the constables. In those moments, as we prepared my suitcase for my departure into the night, I felt more connected to the woman who birthed me than I ever had before. Yes, my brutal murder of her husband had left her shaken, but we both knew that he had earned every single wound I inflicted, that he had stripped both of us of who we could have been, if not for his intervention in our lives. Yes, whether actually his child or not, I was a part of him as he was of me. Without that wretched bastard, I would not have been born into this house of horrors. But even if he had taken part in giving me life, he had stripped me of more, and now, even in his well-deserved death, he had taken my humanity, or I had freely given it away to suffer him no longer. I never would have believed it possible only hours before. I ached inside, bidding farewell to my mother. With the tears we both shed, and the manner in which her voice quivered, it was quite evident that she too felt this pain of our likely final goodbye. As I fled through the alleys and pathways, I could only hope that the consistent snowfall would cover my tracks by the time the search for my father's killer would begin. By the time I passed the borders of the city, the cold rendering my extremities numb and painful at the same time, I heard the distant whistles of the constable's long night ahead. Sporadic lights flickered across the distance behind me as my escape led me into a forest. Echoed voices from too far to register called out into the night, yet I had confidence in the fact that I would be safe. Well, safe enough for my end not to be at the hands of the law. But the bitter cold that weakened me all the more with every step I took. Whether this was by design, intent, or simply the nature of my own personal journey, it would not be until some time after I had abandoned not only my suitcase, but the belief that I would survive this night, when that familiar scarlet glow registered with my faltering senses. I had already collapsed to the snow, my clothing drenched and frigid, when the sound of trudging footsteps echoed across the bitter wind. Once more, I felt muscled hands lifting me back to my weakened legs. And once more, that gentle gaze allowed a semblance of hope to warm my frozen heart. I would not fully understand at the time as we crossed the threshold of the pleasant wooden cabin nestled away in the forest that this was indeed my second visitation to the last lodge. In addition, at that moment, I would not fully realize that I would now be devoting my life to this place. But I don't imagine that understanding would have altered anything. From my perspective, some weeks would pass before I would re-enter the world behind those wooden walls. Re-enter, but not remain, of course. By the time I hesitantly made my way through a far less bitter night on a mission to visit my mother, I had already accepted where I now belonged. When the far more content and confident woman opened the door of my father's old home, though, I would have barely recognized her, if not for the familiar shock in her eyes when she fully realized who I was. We spoke for a time, her filling me in on the last year of her life, while I attempted to rationalize the prior weeks. Neither of us could fully comprehend how this had happened, nor how or why the investigation into my father's murder had led them to two vagrants who had appeared bruised and beaten, but were in possession of the weapon which ended his life. Not only that, but they confessed to the break-in and of the gruesome crime. In addition, they admitted to a series of violent acts they had committed: assaults, rapes, and murders. Murders, including that of the son of the man they had killed in the night, earlier that very evening. My mother had remarried some months prior to my visit, a far more humble yet kind-hearted man who wished nothing but to take care of her and help heal her heavy heart. He aided her in coming to terms with the deaths of both her husband, as wretched a man as he was, and her only son. Yes, she knew me to be alive, but had no reason to believe that I may ever return, given what led to my departure in the night. She mourned for me, far more so than the man she had truly accepted to be the monster we both knew him to be. Yet she had moved on, as had I, as I would come to realize. After many years, a lot of growing up, I learned to understand that my father was not completely at fault for what he became. Perhaps he was simply a victim of the era in which he lived, a victim of his own father's cruelty, a victim of forbidden desires on which he chose to force upon a child who was never his to begin with. This realization, of course, did not allow me to forgive him for what he took from me, for what he forced upon me for so many years. I still have no memory of the true events of that night. I have shed tears of guilt for my actions, but not for the life taken. A victim himself or not, he deserved everything I took from him. If indeed it was I who truly wielded that blade against him. I would visit my mother on occasion over the years, but as those years reflected her age far more than mine, it was advised that I abandon my efforts to maintain this relationship. After a long time, I allowed myself to age at a far slower pace, one of the many offerings the lodge may make to entertain its guests for an extended periods. I think I allowed those years to catch up with me a bit before I even understood what was happening, to be completely honest. Those are tales for another time, though. Yes, there are more stories to tell, more to share about what lay ahead for me, as well as what lies ahead for you, dear boy. But this is not the time, I'm afraid.
After those closing words from the elderly man, who still marveled as he sipped from his beer, reluctantly turning down Simon's offer to refill his glass when the final remnants drained into his waiting mouth, a solemn silence consumed the room. As That just said, there was indeed more we had to discuss. But in many ways, I hoped that we could all simply say goodnight and return to our respective homes. I would come to realize, though, that this would be far from the case. Something that not only I couldn't know, but unfortunate news to all who sat perched on either side of the bar at the time. Betty and Dorian both thanked Henry for revealing so much of his story to us, a tormented existence to which none of us could relate, but each of us felt deeply. That was obvious from the haunted expressions I suspect we all shared. Simon did still appear somewhat apprehensive, as Thatch held out a slender hand, but he took it in his, gently yet firmly. The old man assured him once more that he had nothing to fear from the lodge, though there was genuine sympathy in his strained voice when he also stated that our plans to take down the damned place had been in vain. After some further discussion, it was clear that the lodge, or those who controlled it, were all too aware of everything. Not only the nature of the many conversations through which we had whittled away the hours in this very bar, but of the many goings-on within these walls. Though he didn't get into the meat and potatoes, as he called it, of the real motivations behind both this building and the one that lured him in as a tormented adolescent, it was clear that the link between the lodge and the space between was far more ancient than any of us, himself included, could even predict. Of course, as Betty, Simon, and I exchanged some mischievous glances, something that inspired a childlike chuckle from our guest, it was quite evident that we were all on the same page. We were not prepared to simply let things rest, not after all the work we had already put in, and not simply due to the warnings of a friendly, yet still devoted emissary of the building we sought to crumble to its foundation. In many ways, given not only that sneaky giggle from Thatch, but our previous encounters with the man, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a part of him that was in fact friendly to our cause. That if he were not under such supervision himself, he might even join the fight. Of course, these were little more than theories, driven by what I had experienced of the true nature of Henry Arthur Thatch. As the old man lifted himself to his feet again, his knees once more popping, accompanied by a slight moan from his wrinkled lips, I got up from my stool. Betty slid from her seat as well, hesitantly but confidently wrapping her arms around the slender man who now stood between us. This seemed to catch Henry off guard at first, his stature stiffening before growing more relaxed, gently patting his hand on her back.
"It has been a genuine pleasure, my dear,"
he said, a warm smile lighting up his face. "So," I almost reluctantly cut in, "what's next for you? For us, I suppose."
"That remains to be seen,"
he said, giving Simon a friendly nod, slipping his hands behind his back and pacing toward the door. I walked alongside him, pulling open the door to the outside world once we reached it. The cool breeze which drifted across the threshold felt heavenly, making me suddenly aware of how stuffy it had grown within these walls.
"When you are ready, my boy,"
Thatch said as he began to pass through the door,
"I shall be there to accompany you."
When I do enter," I said, my pulse quickening, will I ever be able to come back here?" Henry smiled, standing before me with the open doorway between us.
"The lodge is not a prison, dear Cameron. Do not be afraid of what lies ahead."
Easier said, I chuckled. As Thatch smiled at me, turning on his heels to pace back out into the night, I didn't even think to ask where he was headed, nor how he had arrived here in the first place. There was a scattering of vehicles across the wide parking lot, some belonging to those deep within the space between, and some which may very well be abandoned. But I had a feeling that the old man hadn't driven here. When he was about halfway across the lot, turning back to offer me one last smile and wave, the rumbling of an engine cranking up assured me that he likely had a ride waiting for him. That was enough to allow my imagination to rest a bit, having previously almost expected a phantom doorway to open before him. As a startling sound of screeching tires echoed across the parking area, though, I suddenly felt far less at ease about the friendly elderly man safely reaching whatever destination he had in mind. The smoke of burning rubber blew across the world before me as I caught sight of the bright red paint job of the swiftly approaching car. My instincts practically leaping in front of my common sense, I took off running toward Henry as he appeared to stop in place, dropping his hands to his sides. I felt my heart practically dive upward into my throat as I screamed out, begging the old man to clear the path of the old caddy, which barreled right at him, followed by a dense cloud of smoke. With only feet between us and the rumbling grill just beyond my periphery, I took a literal leap of faith, hoping to everything I held holy that it would be enough. At that moment, I couldn't fully figure out what happened first. My open palms colliding with the slender frame or the front end of the bright red Cadillac slamming into my ribs. But as my body rolled up the elongated hood, my face beating spiderwebs across the windshield, my eyes met the horrified gaze of Reginald Abernathy himself. After he slammed on the brakes, I tumbled hard to the ground before the car, feeling the jarring sensation of either more bones breaking or the already shattered ribs tearing through the flesh. All I knew was that every fiber of my body was screaming in pain, so much that my mind couldn't even hope to pinpoint how badly I was fucked up. Somewhere distant from my spinning head, I heard the gears shift from the vehicle alongside my broken body, halfway expecting it to back up before speeding forward and finishing the job. The sound of the car door opening blended with those of what sounded like fists pounding on glass and screams from somewhere far away. I was aware of my body lifting slightly from the pavement, inspiring an agonized scream from practically within my very soul as the familiar voice begged for forgiveness. "This was not for you. No, no, no!" Abernathy screamed out. Gentle footsteps neared, my consciousness barely hanging on. I was honestly desperate to just pass the hell out, just to not feel the sensation of both pain and fear of whether or not life as I knew it was coming to an end. "This is your fault!" Reg howled, inadvertently dropping me back to the ground as he scrambled to his feet. "You should be lying here, bleeding, not hit." His screams were interrupted by a loud thunk before his body toppled beside where I lay. His back was turned to me so that I had no way of knowing what actually happened, but those screams and pounding noises persisted as well, leaving my mind racing as much as my heart struggled to hold on.
"I'm so sorry, dear boy,"
Thatch said as he knelt down beside me, his cracking knees almost inspiring a strained laugh from my potentially broken jaw.
"I suspected that I had been followed here, but I couldn't. Oh dear."
My vision steadily coming back into focus, I managed to make out the silhouettes beating against the windows and heaving against the closed door of the bar, away from which I had sprinted to save Thatch.
There is no other way,"
Henry almost whispered as he gingerly paced back toward the space between. I assumed that he was about to help those inside to break out, barely even considering why they seemed trapped inside all of a sudden. But as Thatch reached out for the key he had left lying on the ground beside the door, studying it and glancing back at me, I could never have predicted what came next.
"Only the lodge can save you now,"
he said, the tears leaking from his eyes reflecting in the lights of the parking lot.
"Forgive me, my dear Cameron. Please forgive me. But you must survive."
With that, he turned back to face those who finally ceased their attempts to exit. He placed his palm against the glass of the door, momentarily pausing as he glared back at those inside. I saw his body slump, then stiffen, straightening his back as he slid the key into the door. With a resounding click which almost echoed across the world around me, the ground began to shudder beneath me. It was more determination, desperation, and anguish that drove me as I battled to force myself back from the ground. But as I shakily lifted myself, I realized that I could feel absolutely nothing below my waist, toppling me back to the concrete. As the entire structure of the bar on the outskirts of town trembled as though the earth would swallow it whole any second, it was the screams from inside far more than the way the walls shuddered that inspired the agonized shriek to bellow from my open mouth. dragging myself across the concrete, begging my legs to function with everything I had left in me. I once more found every ounce of hope leaving me when the transformation began. It was as though new walls burst from the concrete surrounding the bar, slapping themselves against the trembling building. One after another, they bonded with the structure, encasing it like a goddamn Christmas present. The tiles across the roof appeared to flip themselves around, revealing new, yet ancient ones beneath. After the walls secured themselves in place, large square windows peeled away from within them, revealing that all too familiar, warm, haunting crimson glow from within. As the transition of the place between to the last fucking lodge completed itself, the ground heaved and shuddered once more as trees burst from the concrete like dandelions violently tearing through the splits. The world fell still and silent once more. The door before which Henry Thatch stood creaked open, spilling that scarlet aura across the newly formed forest around me. The concrete was gone, only dirt and grass surrounded me between the skeletal trees I had witnessed in so many nightmares.
I need help!
Henry called out as several silhouetted people fled from the building before me. As they lifted me from the ground, my consciousness once more wavering between this world and many more in which I would rather die, I felt as though I weightlessly hovered toward the wretched cabin.
Will you consent to enter?
Henry asked, his voice shaky and strained. I was only vaguely aware, my head lazily drifting from one side to the other.
Please, Cameron, he screamed. You must give consent.
My mind was still reeling from everything which had occurred over moments at best. So many questions beat against the walls of my scattered brain. What happened to Betty and Simon, not to mention everyone else who dwelled within the space between? What happened to the building itself, for that matter? Was it gone? Consumed? Eaten by the lodge itself? What did Thatch do with Abernathy? Had I allowed Reg to plow down the old man, would I be free of this madness? Or would he just come back again, given that a bullet to the head only slowed him down a bit? Henry still pleaded with me to accept his invitation, assuring me that I would not survive if I did not allow the lodge to bring me back from the brink of death. But regardless of the agony I was in, the greatest pain was within my chest, anguished over what I may have now lost. No matter what the emotional toll this day had taken, though, it was the last desperate attempt of the old man that essentially sealed my fate.
If you do not enter, if you die here and now, all of this was for nothing.
He was right. As infuriating as it was to accept this fact, if Betty, Dorian, and all of those souls I left behind had indeed been consumed to grant me entry to that godforsaken cabin, how could I disgrace their unwitting sacrifice by giving up now?
I consent. I'll enter of my own volition,
I stuttered only moments before that crimson energy embraced me, and my consciousness fell almost blissfully into the black. That's all the time I have left for now. As Henry told me so long ago for me anyway, I am not a prisoner to the lodge, but I'm not free either. My time away from that place is limited. This time, though, it won't take me 30 years to reach out again, or 1 or 2 from your perspective, I suppose. There's more to tell, and my mission hasn't changed. One way or another, be it in this life or whatever comes next for me, I will put an end to that fucking place. I've already died more than a few times in service of that place. Those are stories for another time, though. It would seem that we still have a lot to catch up on, after all. For now, though, well, and my story isn't finished just yet.